Welcome to Ray's Reflection, the Common Man's Bible Study. Today we are going to start at Acts chapter 23, verse 12. Now from Acts 23, verse 12, as I told you last week, from verse 12 through to the end of the chapter, God is not mentioned. I think what you're looking at is you're looking at the providence of God. And I want you to take and pull yourself away from the big picture. Paul has been arrested by the Romans and has been taken from them. And he's been put in the barracks overnight, and there he appears to see, Jesus appears to him and tells him that he's going to be going to Rome. Now, if you look at the big picture, as I said, you begin to see that at the beginning of the book of Acts, which is the beginning of the church, you see the activity of the Holy Spirit manifested very clearly. He's manifested in fire, he's manifested in sounds, he's manifested in speaking in tongues and miracles and that sort of thing, great orations. But as the time passes throughout the beginning of this church, as the time passes for Paul, we're in the 50s here, late 50s, 60s, you begin to see that this spectacular show of God's intervention into the beginning of his church kind of takes a background, kind of moves to the background and doesn't come to the forefront. So that today, when we look around for the spectacular, it's not here. But yet, God is still working. And this is called the providence of God. God has a plan, and he will do whatever it is to carry out that plan. But he will do it in the background. And mankind has a free will or free choice, if you wish. And regardless, he is limited within his choices. God takes his choices and uses those choices to fulfill his plan. One of the things I like to use to explain providence of God is what we call prevenient grace. The working of God in the life of an individual to get him to the point of decision. I remember a professor once telling me, he says, it's very much like a man trying to cross a bridge with a donkey, and the donkey doesn't want to cross the bridge. So the man picks the donkey up, moves him to the middle of the bridge, and the man continues across. Now the donkey is free to choose. He can go back, he can stay where he is, or he can go forward. But the choice is his. What it took to move him to the point of that choice, we call prevenient grace. What it takes for to move a man to a point where he can make a decision for salvation is prevenient grace. It's the work of God in the life of man, sort of like behind the scenes. Well, this is basically what the providence of God is. Now, Paul has just been told by Jesus Christ that he will go to Rome and he will witness for Jesus in Rome. Right now, he's in Jerusalem, and he's under the care of the Roman guards so that the Jews do not kill him. He's going to end up in Rome, so with all confidence, you have to believe he will end up in Rome. What we look at is another area you might want to look at and study, which would be very beneficial, is the conversation Pilate had with Christ during the crucifixion, during his passion. And he looked at Christ and he says, don't you know that I have the power to crucify you or to release you? And Jesus answered and said, you have no power than that which is given to you from heaven. And Pilate was given the power to crucify Christ. He was not given the power or the authority to release him. And Pilate tried 6 times to release him and could not do it. This is the providence of God. This is the working of God in the decisions of man. And we're going to see this even though God is not mentioned. So I want you to watch for it. It's a kind of historical setting. It's not religious. It's no Christian tenet in there, no dogma or teaching. It's just watching God maneuver things and what he uses. It's amazing. It says this And when the day, verse 12, and when it was day, certain of the Jews band together, this is the providence of God, certain of the Jews band together and bound themselves under a curse, saying that they would neither eat nor drink till they had killed Paul. This is amazing. It really is amazing. 40 men, and they were more than 40 who had made this conspiracy. More than 40 men took a vow before God that they would kill the Apostle Paul. They would not eat or drink anything until he was killed. Now you ask yourself, does history record or does the Bible record any of these more than 40 men dying? Dying of starvation and dying of thirst? And the answer is no. Why not? Because they could easily go to the high priest and be forgiven. The debt or the vow could be removed or forgiven, which was a joke. It literally was a joke. And notice what the vow was. The vow was to commit murder. And here you are vowing to God to commit murder. And it's almost, if it wasn't so true, it would be laughable. And they came to the chief priests and the elders and said, we have bound ourselves under a great curse that we will eat nothing until we have slain Paul. Now therefore ye with a council signify to the chief captain that he bring him down unto you tomorrow, as though we would inquire something more perfect concerning him. In other words, this is a pretense. They said, go to the chief captain of the Roman guards and get him to bring him down to us so that we can examine him further and get more information and clear certain things up. And this is not what they had any intention. They had no intention of finding out any facts. None at all. Once he was down in their midst, etc., they would instantly kill him. And it says, and we, before he comes near, are ready to kill him. In other words, before he gets here, we'll be all set to ready to kill him. So here's a plot to commit murder. And they're going to do it under the guise of fooling the Romans into thinking they're very sincere in questioning Paul more clearly. And when Paul's sister's son heard of their lying in wait, he went and entered into the barracks and told Paul. Now, obviously Paul's sister's son, Paul obviously here had a nephew, and this boy, we don't know how old he was, and we will see that he was quite young. And he heard about this. He heard that they had done this, etc. How did he hear? I don't know. But he did. So we can see that God allowed him to hear this. And because of his age, he wasn't a suspect. No one would suspect him of spilling the beans, so to speak. Then Paul called one of the centurions onto him and said, bring this young man onto the chief captain, for he has a certain thing to tell him. In other words, he called one of the guards and he said, listen, bring him to the chief captain. He's got something to say to the chief captain. It might influence the way he does things. So he took him and brought him to the chief captain and said, Paul the prisoner called me unto him and asked me to bring this young man unto thee, who has something to say to thee. Then the chief captain took him by the hand and went with him aside privately and asked him, what is it that thou hast to tell me? Now how old is a young man to be taken by the hand and moved to a side away from people, etc., so that what they were saying could not be heard? Took them by the hand. How old was this boy? Now you begin to see that in the providence of God, we're not confined to adults. God can use anything. And if you have studied the Old Testament at all, God can use animals. God can use donkeys to speak to prophets. And therefore, there is nothing within this providence of God that is hands-off, so to speak, or not used by God. God can use anything. Here he's using a young boy that had to be led by the hand aside from the crowd of people so that they could speak privately. Interesting. And here's the other interesting part. Who would listen to this young man? Who would believe this young man? This is why the more than 40 Jews, etc., really didn't pay much attention to him. Who would listen to a young man, a young boy who had to be led by the hand? That he had this big plot revealed. And he said, verse 20, and he said, the Jews have agreed to desire thee that thou wouldst bring down Paul tomorrow unto the council, as though they would inquire somewhat that he be of him more perfectly or more completely. But do not thou yield unto them. He says, don't do that, don't do that. He says, for there lieth in wait for him of them more than 40 men who have bound themselves with an oath, that they will neither eat nor drink till they have killed him. And now are they ready, looking for a promise from you. A promise, obviously, from you that you would bring them down, bring Paul down into the council. Now, this, if you look at verse 21, this is coming out of the mouth of a young boy who was led by the hand. So therefore, you can see that the particulars here are laid out specifically. They're not stuttered like a lot of times when you're talking to young people, etc. You get pieces here and a piece here and a piece here, and they're not necessarily in order. And look how orderly this is given. This is given as if an adult, a well-intelligent an adult is sitting on a witness stand giving testimony, and it's coming out of the mouth of a young boy. So therefore this is astounding. So the chief captain then let the young man depart and charged him, see thou tell no man that thou hast shown these things to me. Don't tell anyone that you've spoken to me about this. Just go your way. And he did that, obviously, to protect the young man. And I'm beginning to wonder if he had to do that. These 40 men, etc., were very arrogant, very egotistical, etc. They would never believe that this young boy could do this sort of thing. And what did God do to make this captain believe this young man? It seems to me, in today's world, if a young person like that, young, had to be led, revealed a scheme to murder someone, certainly the police or the chief captains or the detectives, etc., would send someone to investigate any part of the story to see if it was true, see if it had any validity. And yet here it was believed. Do you see the hand of God in maneuvering the captain and influencing the captain and so on? And giving this young man the ability to articulate a plot succinctly, as if he were an adult on a witness stand. And then Paul says this, and he called unto him 2 centurions. So that would be a centurion would be a leader of 100 men, so he called 2 of them, so now he's got 200 men. Make ready 200 soldiers to go to Caesarea, and 70 horsemen, so you've got 270 men, and 200 spearsmen, so now you're up to 470 men at the 3rd hour of the night. In other words, basically 3 o'clock in the morning, basically what he's talking about. And provide beast that thou may set Paul on, and bring him safely unto Felix the governor. Now, Felix is in Caesarea, and he is the governor, obviously, of Judea, and he's going to be the one who's going to trial this. He said, and he wrote a letter after this manner, and he wrote a letter to Felix, and this is what he wrote: Claudius Lysias, and that's who this captain is. He says, unto the most excellent governor Felix, greetings. This man was taken by the Jews, and would have been killed by them. Then came I with an army and rescued him, having understood that he was a Roman. Now that's a little bit twisted, see. He's beginning he's telling Felix that he rescued this man because he believed Paul to be a Roman. No, he didn't. He saw a murder, someone being beaten in a crowd, and he came down to settle the peace. And he was going to whip Paul, and then he found out that Paul was a Roman. But yet here he makes it look like he rescued Paul because Paul was a Roman. And when I would have known the cause for which they accused him, I brought him forth into their council, whom I perceived to be accused of the question of their law. But it had nothing laid to his charge worthy of death or bond. In other words, I brought him to the Jews, because he had violated, according to them, he had violated their laws. But I found out that he hadn't done anything that was worthy of death. There was nothing that the Jews should have killed him for, nor should we. And he says this, and when it was told me how the Jews laid wait for the man, in other words, when I discovered this plot to kill him, I sent immediately to thee and gave commandment to his accusers also to say before thee what they had against him. Farewell. He says, not only did I bring him to you, but I also told them that if they had an accusation, they were to come to you and bring their accusations. And they will. You will see that. They will. It says this, then the soldiers, as it was commanded them, took Paul and brought him by night to Artapatris. Now, Artapatris is right about here. Now, you can see it here on the map here. Now, if you look at this, this is about halfway to Caesarea. This would take him, with his 470 soldiers, they would go all the way down to here, to Artapatris, and there he would return, the soldiers would return back to Jerusalem, and there would be just a company here, small company, maybe a couple hundred or less, would take them all the way to Caesarea, because this area here, Samaria, they're not very friendly with the Jews, would not be dangerous to them, whereas this here would be very dangerous. They could be attacked at any time by the zealots. So this is what happened. This is how far he brought them, under armed guard, and then from there, a smaller unit. And then it says this, okay, on the next day, they left the horsemen to go with him and return to the barracks. See, these horsemen, these extra 270 men were sent back to Jerusalem, whom they came to Caesarea and delivered the epistle to the governor, presented Paul also before them. So now they're in Caesarea, they're here in Caesarea, and they're before the governor Felix, and they give him the letter. And when the governor had read the letter, he asked of what province he was. And when he understood that he was of Cilicia, now Paul was of Cilicia, or from Tarsus. Tarsus is basically the major city in the province of Cilicia. And Felix here has authority over Cilicia. So therefore, if this man is from Cilicia, then therefore he falls under the authority of Felix. And Felix took that authority. He says, I will hear thee, said he. He says, and I will hear thee when thy accusers are also come. And he commanded him to be held in Herod's judgment hall. Now, let's understand something. Felix is a waste. He's a terrible, terrible governor. He's his wife he has stolen from his brother. A historian has recorded that Felix was a man who had a king's realm, and he ruled it like a pauper. Literally, he didn't care pretty much about the people. He didn't care much about law and order. He didn't care much about anything. All he cared about is his own sensual experience in life. And he wanted to experience the good life, and he took what was good, and that was it. So for him to be involved in this sort of thing really became difficult for him. In other words, if it were not for the providence of God guiding the hands of the soldiers, guiding the hands of the centurion who wrote the letter, guiding the mouth of the young boy and so on, if it wasn't God doing this, etc., Felix would be out of the picture completely. He was just a terrible, terrible individual. He was immoral. He was terrible. And probably out of the governors, he was probably the worst. And after 5 days, Ananias, the high priest, descended with the elders and with certain orators named Tertullus, who informed the governor against Paul. So now the high priest is coming, and he's bringing his entourage of people, but he also brings an orator. He brings a lawyer, someone who's used to orating in a court of law, and he's going to speak for the Sanhedrin. this man is, you can tell by his silver tongue that he is, the evil just exudes out of him. And here's the accusation. And when he was called forth, Tertullus began to accuse him, saying, seeing, there's Tertullus, seeing that that by thee we enjoy great quietness, and that very worthy deeds are done unto this nation by thy province. You cannot believe a greater lie. This is a schmooze job. This is flattering someone who has no business being flattered. And this guy here is a silver tongue. You know, people know he's lying. People know he's lying, but they love to hear it. And Felix is not a dummy. He may be an immoral man. He may be a lazy man. He may be a poor ruler, but he's not stupid. He knows he's being flattered for a reason, and therefore he allows it. And most people do. If you've ever been flattered, overly flattered, I should say, and that's what this is. If you've ever been overly flattered, etc., there's something in you that tells you, okay, what do you want, bud? You know, you can tell this guy is buttering you up so that he can get something, etc. But you like to hear it. Something inside you, you know, yeah, okay, let's hear what he has to say. And I think Felix is that way. He's listening to this orator whose syrup coming out of his mouth is just sickening. And he says, and he talks about, he says, seeing that by thee we enjoy great quietness, Felix did nothing to bring the peace. He did nothing. In fact, there was a riot once and he blotched it terribly and people died. And he says, and very worthy deeds are done unto this nation by thy provision. Felix has provided nothing to the nation, and yet here he is being told these lies. We accept it always and in all places, most noble Felix, with all thankfulness. In other words, what are they thanking him for? There is nothing to thank Felix for. And yet here's this man spouting this syrup. Notwithstanding that I be not further tedious unto thee, in other words, I could say more, but I don't want to. And therefore he's going to list it here. And when people say, I could say more, they really don't have anything more to say. And, you know, you see this. You see this with preachers, etc. And as they're preaching, etc., they come towards the end of the sermon, etc. They say, now I have a lot more to say, but time is running out on us. And the answer is simply this: you don't have more to say. You're just saying that to make yourself look good. And that's what he's doing here. I beseech thee that thou wouldest hear us of this clemency, a few words. In other words, I beg you that you'd listen to us. For we have found this man a pestilent man. In other words, he's a pain in our side. He's like a pestilence. He's like a plague. And therefore he says, here are the accusations that he brought against him. Number one, he's seditious or treason against Rome. That's what he says. See, he says, a mover of sedition among all the Jews. In other words, he's getting the Jews to rebel against Rome or commit treason. And the treason they're committing, etc., is they're accepting King Jesus as king as opposed to Caesar as king. And therefore that is treasonous. And so he's saying this is treasonous, and we will talk about this more next time. And the ringleader of the sect of the Nazarene. Now, the sect of the Nazarene were the assassins. And therefore he's saying he's a member of this Nazarene because Jesus Christ was from Nazareth. And therefore they make the connection. And this is totally false. And the third thing they accused him of was, who also hath gone about to profane the temple. So when you look at this, you see that sectarianism, which is the Nazarenes, which is, he's against the Jews, and Paul was never against the Jews. And then it was sacrilegious because he profaned the temple, he's against God. So he's against Rome, he's against the Jews, and he's against God. Now, he says, we would have judged him according to our laws, but but obviously they couldn't. So what we have is we have false accusations brought before Felix. And these Jews and this clever silver-tongued spew of syrup is speaking, and he's trying to get Felix's ear, and Felix may be a terrible ruler, but he's not a dummy. And therefore, he's going to give Paul his chance to speak. So we're going to pick this up next week, and we're going to look at these three things that Paul is accused of, etc., and we're going to look at Paul's retort to this, and we're going to see Felix's response. But through all this, keep in mind that it is the providence of God. God is moving, and we know that Paul has to speak, testify of Jesus in Rome, and therefore we know that this trial in Caesarea is not the end. And therefore there's a lot of traveling for Paul to be done yet. So the object is to look at how God maneuvers, etc., to get Paul out of this situation here and move him on to Rome. So until next week, I bid you Godspeed from on Victory's side. We'll see you next week.